Hello and welcome to Indus News live from Islamabad. I am Munib Hamid with the news of this hour. Let's begin with the top stories first. India has reported a record-high daily surge in COVID-19 infections as over 100,000 people tested positive in a day. Pakistan has registered over 4,300 coronavirus cases and 43 deaths overnight, taking the tally to over 14,800. Globally, the virus has claimed 2.8 million lives and infected over 131 million people so far. China has warned the United States not to take a superior position and presume it has a final say on global affairs. In an interview, Foreign Minister Wang Yi said the door for dialogue with Washington is open, but it must be based on equality and mutual respect. He added Beijing will not accept any unilateral demands from Washington. In Myanmar, pro-democracy activists are holding more demonstrations today after killing of 6 protesters at the weekend. The protesters call for more coordinated nationwide dissent to find the military's moves to suppress their movement. So far, more than 550 people have been killed by security forces since the February 1st coup. In Bangladesh, 26 people have died and several others are missing as a ferry sank after colliding with a cargo vessel in the Shita Lakshya River near Dhaka. Search for survivors continues after the rescue operations were hampered by a storm last night. Last night's storm has hampered the salvage operations as rescuers search for the survivors. These were the top stories. News in detail after a short break. Stay with us. And welcome back. Now let's have the news in detail. India has reported the highest daily cases so far, with more than 100,000 infections overnight. Globally, the virus has claimed 2.8 million lives and infected 131 million others. More about the pandemic in this report.
As many countries are battered with a third wave of COVID-19, experts have already warned of a fourth one shortly. Top US infectious disease expert Dr. Anthony Fauci says getting as many people vaccinated as possible in the shortest period is the only way to avoid another disaster. To ramp up the inoculation drive, the US has put Johnson & Johnson in charge of a plant that ruined 15 million vaccine doses. The country has also stopped the facility from producing the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. Down south, Latin America, however, continues to face grim realities with little reassurance. Just over a week before voters go to the polls to elect a new president, Peru reported a record number of daily deaths. Colombia is set to extend coronavirus restrictions based on intensive care unit occupancy rates.
Tenemos claro.
It's clear that the epidemiological situation in some municipalities have shown increases in recent weeks, and there also exists the risk of a new national increase in coming weeks. We must act, prevent, and take appropriate decisions.
In England, under the new plans, people will be entitled to take a rapid test twice a week to prevent outbreaks and find asymptomatic cases. Portugal, meanwhile, has extended restrictions on travel to neighboring Spain until April 15th. In Thailand, tourism-dependent Phuket Island has embarked on a mass inoculation program 2 months before the rest of the country.
On July 1st, we will open the town for tourists. If we can build immunity for 70 to 80% of the population on the island, we can receive foreign tourists who have been vaccinated without the need for quarantine.
Over in Asia, China reported its highest daily surge in over 2 months as a city in southwestern Yunnan province accounted for all the 15 new local cases.
Meanwhile, in Pakistan, the coronavirus has claimed 43 more lives in the last 24 hours. Health officials say more than 4,300 people tested positive overnight. The nationwide death toll has risen to 14,821. Pakistan has reported 692,000 confirmed cases since the pandemic began. So far, nearly 616,000 people have recovered from the disease. There are more than 61,000 active cases nationwide and nearly 3,600 patients are critical. Meanwhile, thousands of Pakistanis have rushed for inoculation after the commercial sale of COVID-19 vaccines began. The officials at vaccination sites in the southern city of Karachi said the vaccines were already sold out. In another development, President Arif Alvi is chairing a virtual meeting regarding the SOPs during Ramadan. Moving on now, the Afghan government claims to have retaken Arghandab district from the Taliban in an operation backed by air raids. The Defense Ministry said at least 37 Taliban fighters were killed and 28 others were wounded during the operation. The ministry said a large number of Taliban weapons and ammunition were also destroyed. The Taliban have not yet commented on Kabul's claims. Meanwhile, a security personnel was killed and 4 more wounded in an IED explosion in Kabul. No group has claimed responsibility for the blast so far. This comes as Afghan Reconciliation Council Chief Abdullah discussed the upcoming peace talks in Turkey with Turkish and US envoys. Now, China has warned the United States not to take a superior position and presume it has a final say on global affairs. Foreign Minister Wang Yi says the door for dialogue is open, but it must be based on equality and mutual respect. In an interview, Wang said Beijing will not accept any unilateral demands from Washington. Wang said China will not accept a single nation having a final say on world affairs. He added China will take confrontation calmly without any fear if the US continues to go on that road. Beijing's top diplomat reiterated China's right to defend its national sovereignty and dignity. Meanwhile, in Myanmar, the pro-democracy activists are holding more demonstrations today after the killing of 6 protesters over the weekend. So far, security forces have killed more than 560 people since the February 1st coup.
Protesters demanded the restoration of the Aung San Suu Kyi government despite crackdowns on their spring revolution. They urged coordinated nationwide dissent against the coup. This comes after tons of the rebel armies threatened to back protests if the violence does not stop. Minorities on the borders face new fears amid insecurity as conflicts between the army and guerrillas flare anew. Meanwhile, Malaysia and ASEAN's current chair, Brunei, have agreed to meet of regional leaders to discuss the crisis. In a joint statement, Malaysian Prime Minister Muhyiddin Yassin and Brunei Sultan Hassanal Bolkiah said they have directed their ministers to begin the preparations.
Moving on, the death toll from flash floods and landslides in Indonesia and East Timor has topped 100. The meteorological office has warned that more heavy rain is likely to hit the region today. Disaster management officials said 80 people have died while dozens still missing in Indonesia's East Nusa Tenggara province. The added thousands have been displaced after their houses were swept away or buried under the landslides. The disaster mitigation officials said the debris and extreme weather hampered the search and rescue operation. Indonesian President Joko Widodo has offered his condolences and urged people to follow the advice of officials. Meanwhile, the cyclone has claimed 21 lives in neighboring East Timor. Officials said more than 1,500 people have been evacuated to shelters in the capital, Dili. Now moving to Bangladesh, where at least 26 people have died while several others are missing after a ferry sank in the Shita Lakshya River near the capital Dhaka. Police said the ship was en route to Mushinganj from Narayanganj district when it collided with a cargo vessel. Officials say the ferry was carrying around 50 passengers and some of them managed to swim ashore. The passengers were traveling to their hometown after the government announced a new COVID-19 lockdown. Search for survivors continues after the rescue operations were hampered by a storm last night. Meanwhile, more than a dozen people have died after the first tropical storm of the season swept over different regions of the country. A Malaysian court is hearing former Prime Minister Najib Razak's appeal to annul his conviction in the infamous 1MDB scandal. The appeal proceedings are set to run until 22nd of April. Najib, who co-founded 1MDB, was found guilty of laundering $10 million from the state fund. He was sentenced to 12 years in jail and a $50 million fine. The conviction brought down his government in 2018. Najib's lawyers termed his conviction a ministerial and maintained that he did not know about the transactions into his accounts. Now, the European Union has expressed serious worries over Russian troops' movement along the Ukrainian border. The bloc has also pledged its unwavering support for Ukraine's government. EU Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell voiced the support for Kiev after a phone call with Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba. Borrell also said he will hold further talks on the issue with Kiev's top diplomat and foreign ministers from the EU's 27 nations. The Kremlin did not deny the recent troop movement but said that Moscow was not threatening anyone. The military build-up by Russia along the Ukraine border has sparked global concerns over a possible all-out armed conflict. The European Union has termed the departure of all foreign fighters from Libya as a precondition to country stability. European Council's President Charles Michel urged the Libyan factions to seize the unique opportunity to build a sovereign and stable country. Michel made the remarks after meeting with Libya's Prime Minister-designate Abdul Hamid Dbeibah in Tripoli. The Council's President said the European Union actively supports the process of national reconciliation in Libya. He also pledged bloc support for Libya in the areas of economic recovery, elections and fight against illegal immigration. The foreign ministers of France, Germany and Italy have also visited Tripoli recently in a show of support for Libya's newly formed unity government. Now, Israeli authorities have jailed 230 Palestinian children since the beginning of this year. In a report released on local Children's Day, the Palestinian Prisoner Society said the arrests were concentrated in the occupied city of Jerusalem. The Palestinian Children's Day is celebrated on April 5th to raise awareness on the plight of Palestinian children. The rights group that monitors the conditions of detainees in Israeli prisons said the imprisoned children are subjected to various forms of abuse. It said the misconduct includes denying food and drinks for long hours, verbal abuse and detainment under harsh conditions. Meanwhile, Defense for Children International said 85% of children arrested last year suffered physical violence. Now, Palestine's election board has approved a list of 36 candidates to run in the legislative election scheduled for May. The vote is part of an effort by the Palestinian movement Fatah and Hamas to boost international support for governance. President Mahmoud Abbas's Fatah dominates the Palestinian Authority in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. Meanwhile, Hamas has run the Israeli-blockaded Gaza Strip since 2007. The first parliamentary polls in 15 years will be held on the 31st of July. Now, in Israel, a district court has resumed the hearing of corruption cases against Prime Minister Netanyahu. At the opening of the latest hearing, state prosecutors accused Netanyahu of the illegitimate use of power and using favors as currency. They said Netanyahu sought improper benefits from owners of major media in Israel for personal gains. Netanyahu, who denies wrongdoing in all three cases, left the courthouse before the first witnesses was called to testify. This comes as Israel deals with another political deadlock, with no party having a clear majority to form the government. The president is meeting parliamentarians in a bid to resolve the impasse. Moving on now, foreign ministers from Egypt, Ethiopia and Sudan have started fresh negotiations over the Nile Dam dispute in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This dispute over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam built across the Blue Nile has been simmering for around a decade now. Addressing the opening session, African Union Chairman Fili Tshisekedi urged all the parties to launch a new dynamic to resolve the dispute. Meanwhile, Egypt's foreign minister also called the meeting the last chance to relaunch talks on the project. Ethiopia has said it will fill the dam after seasonal rains start this summer. However, both Sudan and Egypt insist on the mandatory filling of the reservoir. More news coming up after a short break. Stay with us. Welcome back now. In the United States, tens of thousands of New Yorkers took to the streets to protest against racism and violence targeting Asian Americans across the country. The march along streets of Manhattan and the Brooklyn Bridge comes as the largest to be staged in New York so far. Organizers say around 500 groups joined the march. The protesters call for an end to hate crimes and racial discrimination, which they say have peaked recently. They also demanded protection of rights of Asians and minorities across the United States. Apart from Asians, the demonstrators also included groups of other ethnic minorities.
Hate for anyone is hate for all, you know, and I just want us all to kind of live together and coexist, and I feel like there should be no negativity between anyone. And I feel the black community and the Asian community, we have our own, you know, beef from before, but we need to put that aside so that we can come together to fight for our lives.
Now, life will never be the same for people in Mozambique's Palma City following the deadly insurgent attacks. Trials and tribulations await the 1,200 survivors who arrived on a boat to Palma City. But NGOs have cast doubts about the city's capacity to embrace such a large influx of people. Let's find out more in this report.
The terrorist attack on Mozambique's Palma City has displaced tens of thousands more who scattered into the surrounding bush or to the beach to try to catch boats. As the attack survivors swarmed the makeshift camp in a sports hall in the Palma City, aid organization Caritas raised concerns about the rise in crime and exposure of people to COVID-19.
The city of Pemba and the infrastructure will not support the number of inhabitants. The city was prepared to accommodate a certain number of people, but now we have a lot of people. For example, now in the market there's lots of people. They are exposed to and can be contaminated by COVID-19.
Besides the sports hall, people are cramming into schools, hotel rooms and temporary shelters. The aid workers say the rising population is putting pressure on food and water supplies as well as healthcare and other services.
What we do is we are contacting our partners for help in funds so that we can assist the displaced people with food. When the center closes, we have to continue to distribute food to those displaced families every month to reinforce the works of World Food Programme because they alone are not taking control of the situation.
The district where Palma is located is adjacent to natural gas projects worth $60 billion. Insurgents attacks have been increasingly active in the surrounding province of Cabo Delgado since 2017.
Now, environmental degradation is undoubtedly the most threatening global challenge of the coming years. An Indonesian environmental activist has taken up the task to prepare coming generations for this challenge using puppet stories. Let's find out in this report.
Wearing a hat shaped as the head of the critically endangered Javan rhino and carrying a box labeled Fairy Tales in local language, Samsudin visits villages to teach children about environmental degradation using puppet stories. His fairy tales are particularly centered on the threat of coastal erosion and how mangrove trees can be used to counter it. The 50-year-old environmentalist has recently brought his puppet show to Indramayu, one of the areas in the country most severely affected by land erosion amid loss of mangrove swamps.
Fungsi mangrove satu adalah
one of the functions of mangroves is that it can act as a barrier to the strong waves from the ocean when it grows up. So waves will not destroy the land, as there can be a lot of damage on land caused by those big waves.
Based on the satellite images, nearly 90% of the entire 114-kilometer coastline of Indramayu has suffered from erosion. Also, around over 6,000 hectares of land is now flooded by seawater due to an encroaching shoreline. Samsudin's team of environmentalists are complementing the efforts by planting young saplings in areas which used to be covered by mangrove trees, but replanting is an uphill battle.
Itu medianya itu kan harus.
The mangrove planting zone must be located in a coastal tidal area. But the coastal areas in Indramayu are rarely exposed to both high or low tides, because mostly we get high tides. And as such, it is very difficult to plant because there is no sedimentation.
As per the Peatland and Mangrove Restoration Agency, over 600,000 hectares of Indonesia's 3.3 million hectares of mangrove are in critical condition. Meanwhile, the country's forestry ministry's data shows that over 1.8 million hectares of mangroves in Indonesia were damaged.
Now in business stories, LG Electronics has announced its complete withdrawal from mobile business after years of money-losing performance. The decision comes amid intensifying competition with bigger rivals. South Korean tech powerhouse says its mobile communications unit will not produce and sell handsets after July 31st. In a regulatory filing, the company said the move will lead to a decline in revenue in the short term. However, it will eventually improve financial status and management efficiency in the long run. LG's mobile business has been in the red since 2015, with accumulated operating losses reaching $4.4 billion last year. Meanwhile, shares in Japan have climbed as many major markets in the Asia-Pacific and Europe are closed for holidays. In Japan, the Nikkei 225 rose close to 1%, while the Topix index advanced over 0.5%. South Korea's Kospi gained marginally but hovered above the flat line. Shares of LG Electronics also ascended over 0.5% after the firm announced it is ending mobile phone production. Now let's have a look at how the weather is doing around the world. Well, that is all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus.News. Take care.